You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. My guest today is Robert Cargill, PhD. He's the Roger Hornsby Associate Professor in Classics, with their Classics. He's the Director of Undergraduate Studies, again, Department of Classics, an editor, part of the Bible and Archaeology area at the University of Iowa. And we're going to talk about biblical archaeology, and I think it'll be very interesting. So welcome.
Rich, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, tell me a bit about your background. How did you get interested in the areas that you study?
Sure. I was a baseball player growing up, so that's what I was supposed to be doing, right? And I basically couldn't hit a slider. I was a very good defensive catcher, so I decided to forego that, and I went into a pre-med discipline. So I was a science mind. Everything was pre-med. I wanted to know how things worked. So I was a pre-med student at Fresno State. I went to Fresno City College, went to Fresno State, and then I decided, I want to know how things work with regard to religion as well. So I decided to go to Pepperdine, and they were gracious enough to have me come down there. And I did Master of Divinity, essentially a seminary degree, did an MDiv there, went and worked at a .com with everyone else for a few years, tried to make some money. And when that bubble burst, went back to work at Pepperdine as a technologist while I did my PhD at UCLA, Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA, studying under Bill Schniedewind, and finished my PhD at UCLA in 2008, where I was essentially looking at the origins of the Hebrew Bible. I wanted to know, again, going back to my natural science roots, I wanted to know how things worked. How did we get this book? Where did it come from? Why was it written the way it was? And that has consumed my life ever since.
Oh, very cool. Okay. What are some things you've learned about, the Old Testament that only came after many years of study that surprised you or you thought were like amazing?
When I was young, I grew up in a denomination called the Churches of Christ, and I was always taught, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, and whether or not you believe it is, conditional, right? It doesn't matter whether you believe it. It's in the Bible, so you have to. So it's true, right? And I began reading things when I was doing my science degree there at Fresno State that I was like, well, science says this, the Bible says this. How do I wrestle with this? And there was a whole lot of cognitive dissonance going on. So I never wanted to publicly challenge those things, but in my head, I was already wrestling with these things. Went through 4 years of, essentially a MDiv degree, always wrestling with this, discovered Hebrew, discovered Greek, started looking at these things and going, hey, this text doesn't match this. Why is that? Why do these two stories, why do they have Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and why do they say something different? And I began asking all of the questions that people do when they begin reading the Bible critically, when they go to seminary, things like that. And that was all it took. I was then asking, I was reading the Bible critically, and instead of just saying, well, we'll just take it on faith, I kept digging. And, I started doing archaeology. I wanted to know evidence. I wanted to be, I guess you could say, in the same way that an apologist wants all of this evidence, I did too, except I came out the other way. I eventually came to the conclusion that, these stories were incorporated from previous Mesopotamian stories. And look, they have this relationship with Egypt. Look at all these other Canaanite stories. And I realized that the Bible was a series of tales, of stories, history, put together by the ancient Israelites, who were basically incorporating their myths, their stories, and infusing those with their ethics. And this became their story. And they wanted to preserve their story. And then at some point, just like, it happens in every religion, they started saying, this really, really happened. Even though there were some people at the time that said, no, this is allegorical, or and thus we have the debate that goes on to this day between those who think this really happened, it's literal, it's factual, it's historical, and those who say, No, it's not necessarily historical. This didn't necessarily happen historically, but it's a story that's trying to convey something that these ancient peoples are trying to tell us about what it means to be human.
Okay. Are you still of faith, or is it, do you think that the Bible, again, is a lot of it may be historically accurate, but it's not necessarily the word of God, or what do you think?
I consider myself today to be an agnostic. Most of my friends are people of faith, Jewish and Christian, some Muslim, but I consider myself, I always felt that someone should take the sacraments in good faith, and I could no longer do that. No one should pretend to be a Christian. And I understand that many of my colleagues who work at Christian universities, who have very good lives, work at these places, and they continue to accept whatever document they have to sign in order to continue to work at these places, but they have questions of their own, and I respect that. You got to take care of your family, and you got to continue to wrestle with these things. I decided that I wasn't comfortable doing that, and so thank heavens for the University of Iowa, where I could study the Bible and teach the Bible from a critical standpoint and look at it as literature and share this with as many people as possible. And again, the Bible is beautiful literature. And if a student comes to me and says, I want to go to seminary, I'm going to teach them everything that they need to know to let them pursue their, life as a seminarian. If somebody says, I love this as, ancient history or, archaeology, I'm going to help them do that. So I see myself as a methodological agnostic who's trying to teach students about the beauty of this ancient book.
Okay. So what, I don't know, which stories stick out in your mind as moving you, let's say, towards agnosticism? Have you settled any big questions? And it seems to decisively point towards, scientific evidence and not towards the Bible. Any examples of stories?
Sure. Well, I mean, all of the typical ones that most people point to, who was created first, right? Adam or the animals, right? So Genesis 1 would tell us that the animals were created before Adam. Genesis 2 would tell us that Adam was created before the animals. How many animals were on the ark, right? Was it one pair, male and female, or was it 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals, right? These are the standard go-to things that people call them contradictions, but what they are is they're 2 different stories. They're 2 different traditions that the ancient Jews said to themselves, we have these ancient traditions, these ancient stories, and we want to preserve them both. And we're going to put the Genesis stories at the front. We're going to put the flood stories together, and we don't care if they don't match. These are our stories. These are our traditions, and we'll put them together. So they have a conquest narrative, they have an Exodus narrative, and when you see the internal contradictions in the Bible. So those standard ones were the ones that got me going, maybe this, the fact that there's languages that exist before Hebrew, that takes a long time to develop languages. They don't just show up at the Tower of Babel, things like that. But it was the ethical things. It was the social issues, the suppression of women, the way that the Bible treats the LGBTQ plus community. The ownership of slaves is kind of a big one, right? That the fact that the Hebrew Bible says that it's okay to have slaves, shows you how to make a slave, and that the New Testament doesn't have I have a dream speech. It actually says slaves obey your master. These social issues were the ones that put me over the top and said, maybe this book is just a product of its time. And they're doing their very best to convey what they believed at the time to be the best view of the world that they had, that reflected their view of God of the time, but that maybe, just maybe, that's not actually the way that the world worked.
Well, yeah, some of the stories may be harder to substantiate than others, but, what about, let's say, Sodom and Gomorrah? Supposedly I've seen, who knows if it's real, people that have gone there to present day, and they found sulfur balls, they found scorched earth, they found structures that looked like, they were part of a city. It seems like there's quite a lot of corroboration from biblical archaeology or archaeology to the Bible. King David, his name was found, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, if we can, identify which city is Sodom, right? There's a debate over which city is Sodom. Different scholars claim to have identified this city. Right? The entire region, right, is at the north end. I think if there was an ancient Sodom, that it would be on the north end of the Dead Sea, not on the southern end. The whole place smells like sulfur. It's incredibly hot. There are earthquakes. There are, you have the context for, you can see where these myths come from, right? Lot's wife turning to salt. You can see the salt pillars, this natural occurring phenomenon of salt pillars growing up. And from a distance, you can look and you can say, oh, I see how that can look like a human. And you can understand where you get the story of Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt. You have the Tel Dan inscription that has, Beit David, right? It's written in Aramaic by neighboring country, talking about how they conquered this people that refers to themselves as the house of David. Is that explicit evidence for David? No, but it is evidence that a people referred to themselves as the house of David. So yeah, that's pretty good evidence that there was a David. At least these people called themselves the children of David, right? So, but I have no problem saying that David existed, right? That's not a problem. Was he as big of a deal? Or was he a chieftain, a prince, something like that? Those things, especially when we get down into the kings, that's fine. It's the primordial stuff. It's the earlier stuff that we're probably going to have the issue with.
But if I don't know, would you say a good amount of the quote unquote later stuff is corroborated? Does that mean that the earlier stuff is true, or does it have no bearing? It's like past performance is no indicator of future results. Is it like that?
Yeah, no. The way that I teach it is anybody who says that you should take the Bible 100%, it's inerrant, it's infallible, I think that's not a correct way to read the Bible. I also think that anybody who says, these stories can't be true, so we should throw out the whole thing, that's also an inappropriate way to read the Bible, right? For every story in the Bible, the conquest of Jericho, right, that I can say, actually, the archaeology says something different than we have in the text, right, in the story. Now, there's always going to be some apologists say, no, it actually happened this way. No. But for every story that we have in the Bible that says one thing and the archaeology tells us something different, I can show you another story that we have in the Bible where the archaeology corroborate maybe that claim. So, the Bible is this collection of stories over time that was pieced together by a people that was trying to make a case. They were trying to make a case that their God was the correct God, the one true God, the God that you ought to worship, and that their kings, their people were the right people. We're right, they're wrong. And sometimes they, fudged the story a little bit because they were trying to make a point, and sometimes they told the story exactly as it happened. And what I'm always after is, okay, the archaeology doesn't line up with this story. Why did they tell the story the way they did? What was the motivation? Was there a political motivation? Was there an economic motivation? That's what a lot of critical scholars are trying to do.
Well, tell me an example. Tell me one of the most contentious things that you discovered or of where people are like, gets people crazy to even talk to you about. Just start out nicely.
Sure. Yeah. Let's get people throwing rocks at their at their computers. The Exodus that comes up a lot, right? You have this beautiful, beautiful story of the Exodus for which we have no evidence. Now, people get mad when I say no evidence, but you have evidence of the context, right, of the Exodus. But, within the Bible itself, you have a discrepancy chronologically, right? So you end up having people who believe there was an actual Exodus. You have the early Exodus folks and you have the late Exodus folks. Because you have two different ways of dating this thing. And of course, we have no archaeological evidence that there was this Exodus. And we have a whole lot of archaeological evidence that Judah was allies, was essentially, basically they were in a pretty good relationship with Egypt. Every time we're digging up things in southern Israel and central Israel, they've got ankhs on them. They've got all of this iconography that demonstrates that Egypt was one of the powers in this region, and they were if they weren't fine with it, they were at least Egypt was the power in the region. So the Exodus is one that becomes a story that appears to be a foundation myth for the people of Israel, who were the Israelites, who were essentially Canaanites, who were always there. And as they grew and tribed up and became these and differentiated themselves from other Canaanites, they wanted a story about how they came to be. What's our foundation myth, right? We Americans have this, right? Flipping a dollar in the, was it the Potomac? Or crossing the Potomac and chopping down the cherry tree. I never tell a lie. We have these stories as Americans, whether or not they happened or not, we don't know. But we have these foundation myths, right? How was Rome created, right? You have Romulus and Remus and this myth, and this is the foundation of Rome. We have these stories. and so does ancient Israel. But that doesn't mean they're historical. They're still beautiful stories imbued with these incredible ethics and these identity markers of here's what we do as a people who has suffered in the past. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're historical.
All right, how about now a story that is highly corroborated with what the archaeology says, but you think was tweaked a little bit. But again, the evidence supports it really, really strongly that it happened.
I can give you a couple of them. One is when King Sennacherib comes down to, basically level the cities of Judah in Isaiah 36 through 39. You have this story of the Rav Shake is coming up, and he's basically going to say, you have not been loyal because, Judah was a vassal to the Neo-Assyrian. And so he says, you haven't been doing what we told. It looks like you're planning to rebel. And when you first read this in, is it 2 Kings 18? Is it 2 Kings 18? You have the story of Hezekiah basically comes out and says, whatever you want, I will pay you. I have sinned, I've done wrong. And he goes in and he basically strips the gold off the door in the temple, pays off Sennacherib. Sennacherib goes away. Then you have this story of they come back and they have this taunting, right? This taunting between the Rav Shaka down below and the attendants of Hezekiah inside the city. And he basically says surrender, and Hezekiah doesn't want to surrender. Isaiah says take the surrender letter, throw it on the altar. And then you get this story that says that an angel of the Lord came down and killed all of the Sennacherib's troops, and then they all died, right? Sennacherib tells the story that he went up against Hezekiah and surrounded the city wrapped up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. Mentions Hezekiah, mentions, the city of Jerusalem, putting it under siege, right, his capital, and then demanding this payment from him, and then leaving. So it's two different versions of the story in 2 King. It's not exactly the story Sennacherib tells and the Bible tells. They're not exactly identical, but one thing we do know is that Jerusalem wasn't conquered. It was put under siege, and Jerusalem survived. And this is corroborated by Sennacherib's annals and by the Bible. These other cities were destroyed. Samaria was destroyed, but Jerusalem was put under siege and survived, and this is corroborated by extra-biblical evidence.
Okay, so you think that, most of it happened, but it was it's a major part of it, but that part is in dispute because of the different stories. I understand.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the major players, one of the major moments in Jerusalem's history that caused this city to be understood as an inviolable city, right? Sennacherib was leveling, the Neo-Assyrians were leveling all of these other cities, including, right, Judah's enemies to the north, Israel, Samaria, but they couldn't take Jerusalem. Now, however it happened, whether Hezekiah paid him off or whether an angel of the Lord came down and killed him, right? People would say, well, Sennacherib would never admit that, right? So they just retreated. Regardless of what happened, he didn't take Jerusalem. Jerusalem survived, and because of that, Jerusalem got this reputation of a city that couldn't be conquered, to the point where Jeremiah starts basically saying, you guys think that this city is inviolable. You keep saying the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, but that's not true. This city is not inviolable. You better start behaving properly, and on and on and on. You have other pieces of evidence like a ration tablet that was discovered inside the city of Babylon that actually mentions Yahudu, right? The king that was exiled, and basically the allowance that he was given. And you go back and you read in the Bible that a king was sent into, this is Jehoiakim, right? He was exiled into Babylon, and he was given a regular allowance for he and his court that was exiled. And so we have some corroboration that the king of Israel, the king of Judah was exiled, and that you have this extra biblical verification of that.
Do you find any stories that there's, I don't know, I guess I would say like they're really, really, really far back, but still there is corroboration? Like, what are some of the oldest stories for which you've found corroboration?
Oh, off the top of my head, oldest stories for which we find corroboration. Again,
like what about the Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance? Well, it appears that almost all the old, I know it doesn't mean it's true, but almost all the Old Testament supposedly is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what does it tell you that it looks to be almost completely unchanged over thousands of years. Does that tell you anything about the importance of these writings?
What the Dead Sea Scrolls can tell us, and again, they date, as the earliest ones to the late 3rd century BC, all the way down through the end of the 1st century AD. If you count the Copper Scroll, which I think was tossed in there as a separate document, but that might be 2nd century AD. But what this tells us is, the way I always put it is, you've got some scrolls, right? You've got a copy of every biblical Hebrew Bible. There's no New Testament at Qumran, but you've got all of the Hebrew Bible documents with the exception of Esther. Remember, Ezra and Nehemiah were considered one scroll, but everything with the exception of Esther. Please keep in mind that Esther was, I don't want to say contested, but there was a question about how biblical, quote unquote, Esther was, because Esther's the book that never mentions God, right? Never explicitly mentions God. So we don't have Esther from Qumran. We don't know whether that's because we just never found a copy of it, or they didn't think it was part of the canon. But we have all of the copies of all of these other books. Some of them are meticulously copied, letter for letter, to the point where, 99% of it, 98% of it, letter for letter, is identical. And so this tells us two things. One, the people who were bringing these scrolls to Qumran, or were copying these scrolls at Qumran, because the scrolls at Qumran were both brought to Qumran and were copied at Qumran, those people took the Bible seriously. They took the text of the Bible seriously. And that's so seriously that they made sure to meticulously copy this text letter for letter. But there's also every page, every column, you've got one or two letters, maybe a word that's different. And of course, that's the stuff that fascinates scholars. Why did they change this word? Was it just a mistake? Were they sleepy? Was it late? Or did they do it deliberately? And of course, when you start looking theologically at these Peshrim, right, these Peshers that they are writing, if you look at the sectarian literature that they're composing, you begin to think, oh, maybe they're altering some of these texts for theological reasons because they believe something, let's say, different from what they believed at the temple. But what the scrolls tell us is they were very serious about copying the text of the Bible. That doesn't necessarily mean that the stories contained in the Bible happened. It means that they thought that they happened to the extent that they wanted to make sure to copy them. Your earlier question about the earliest one that I can think of, and again, it doesn't mean that it happened the way that we have it in the Bible, but that it mentions him at least, is the prophet Balaam. We actually have a text, I want to say 9th century, might be 8th century. There's a debate over whether it's actually written in Aramaic, but we have an inscription written on a wall at Deir Allah, this is in modern-day Jordan, that mentions the prophet Balaam. And of course, if you read the book of Numbers, you can read about the prophet Balaam. This is the guy who was kind of hired to come and curse Israel, but every time he opened his mouth, God made him bless Israel. There was actually, apparently, at least there was a legend, a story about an actual prophet named Balaam who was wandering around the region at the time, to the extent that somebody wrote a text about a prophet named Balaam who was a seer of the gods, against polytheistically. So it's a different story than we have in the Bible, but apparently there was a famous prophet named Balaam running around that region. So again, the story's a little different like we have with Sennacherib, but at least you have this attestation of this individual that we then find in the Bible. That's the earliest one off the top of my head.
Has your work contributed to certain people saying, you see, it is true? What has it done, you show?
What I've tried to do with my public scholarship is try to get people interested in, let's call it the context of the Bible. So when I wrote The Cities That Built the Bible, the whole point of this book was to walk people through in a popular way, right, for a popular audience, how we got the Bible that we have today. And so people who believe that the Bible is inerrant, infallible, will read this and say, oh, this guy's a critical scholar. We can't trust him, right? Look at all this stuff that he's pointing out that doesn't agree with the way that I read the Bible. But what I try to do is to say, look, here's the Phoenician alphabet. Let's start, way back at the beginning. Let's look at Ugarit. Look at these gods that the Old Testament's talking about. Then let's work our way through Nineveh, right? Let's look at the Neo-Assyrians. Let's look at Babylon. Let's look at the context of all of these cities that produced the Bible, to the point where, a lot of maybe conservatives and fundamentalists will think that I'm too liberal And a lot of liberals will think that I'm too conservative. And, that usually means that I'm right in the middle. But I'm trying to just illuminate the context behind the Bible and just take a look at how we got this book. When I wrote the book on Melchizedek, this is a critical examination of how this character that we have in the Bible, my argument is how he was invented.
What are your thoughts then on like the Apocrypha and, the Gnostic Gospels and everything? There's fights about those.
Mm-hmm.
Have you been bothered to look at those, or do you feel like,
Sure.
How do they look under scrutiny versus canon type material?
Sure. So I teach a course. I ripped off Bart Ehrman. So thank you, Bart. Called Banned from the Bible, and it's on the pseudepigrapha and Apocrypha. We try to teach both the Hebrew Bible, the pseudepigrapha there, and then the New Testament Apocrypha. I always describe the Septuagintal texts that weren't in the Hebrew Bible, but that ended up in the Septuagint. All of some of the other Hebrew texts, maybe from Qumran, some of these things. I often try to use the analogy for my students as kind of fan fiction. A lot of these texts are trying to fix plot holes that they found in the Bible, right? So Jubilees or Enoch, they're going to take, let's take Enoch, for example. They're going to read Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and they're going to say, what do you mean? What is these Nephilim? What do you mean sons of God had sex with the daughters of men? And so you're going to get this entire story about how this came about. They're going to give you the backstory, right? So we watch Star Wars, for instance, and then, 20 years later, you're going to get the Solo movie, or you're going to get the Mandalorian, or you're going to get these stories. Rogue One is the example that I use, right? Why would you build a Death Star that, you can just blow up from the outside of the Death Star with one shot? Oh, it turns out in Rogue One, it was built that way on purpose. It was all part of a master plan, right? They're filling the plot hole. They're fixing the plot hole. And I think a lot of the extra-canonical texts are basically trying to go back and trying to fill these plot holes. Jubilees does this all the time, right? Jacob will make a promise. I promise to tithe when I get back. And in the Bible, there's no mention of Jacob ever tithing. So when Jubilees retells this story, Jacob's tithing here, he's tithing again there, he's tithing again there, right? Just to make sure that this patriarch is fulfilling his promise. And there's all kinds of these fixes, these plot fixes. So it's a lot of that. In the New Testament, I think you have something a little different, and that is there wasn't a uniform view of Christianity. Now, granted, there wasn't a uniform view of Judaism either, but one of the beautiful things about Judaism is they took all of these various points of view, Deuteronomy, Job, right, all the mission of the Talmud, and they just canonized all of it. In New Testament, you have these different Christianities, even we could say, these different views of Jesus, these different versions of Christianity, and they really wanted to narrow it down to one official view. And so all of these other views, people call these the Gnostic texts, or those were basically kicked out early on, and those texts basically disappeared. And it was with the discovery of these texts now that everybody's fascinated by them, because a lot of those texts, the Gospel of Philip, right, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, these were attempts to go back and tell their backstory, to be apologies for them, to say, oh, no, Judas wasn't a betrayer. He was actually trying to help Jesus, right? So they're doing the same thing, but they were pushed out because they had already fixated on an official version of Trinitarian Christianity.
Why did the Trinitarian Christianity have such good PR people versus the authors of the Gnostic Gospels and again the Apocrypha?
I don't know if it was necessarily good PR people or better.
I'm just teasing you, but I'm saying
it's winners write history, and so yes, they had good PR people. They also had good weaponry. They also got lucky, in some battles and with some weather and all of the things. Eric Klein would say, when they talk about what caused the collapse of the late Bronze Age, it's not one thing, it's lots of things. And so, you could make a case that the Arians were going to win that thing, and then the tide turned and the Trinitarians ended up winning. I do an exercise with my students in class. What if the Arians had won? What if the Trinitarians didn't win? What if the Arians had won? And what would Christianity look like today? What would be the doctrines? What would be the just as an exercise to demonstrate that Christianity was incredibly diverse. Let's look at Thomas. let's look at some of these other texts. What if they hadn't thrown out Barnabas, right? What if they hadn't thrown out the Didache? How would the practice of Christianity be different, or would it? And I always get a student saying, no, it would be the same because God, has his hand guiding this Okay, that's a fair answer, right? We're dealing with faith. But I like to ask these questions just to get students thinking. At the end of the day, I make a promise to every student in every class that I teach. I will never, ever tell you what to believe. My job is to give you this information, to expose you to these ancient texts, and to get you to think critically about them. And then it's up to you to decide what you want to do with them, if you want to take another class. But I want to just show you what's there. There's more than just that one book. There's a lot of other material out there, and I just want them to think about it.
What if you now consider, secular history or mainstream history? What percentage of history do you think is actually accurate?
That is a great question, Rich.
Well, I worry about it. The more I learn about stuff, the more I go, oh no, how much of it's actually accurate? How different is what really happened?
Well, and, of course, this is the question that you ask in the introduction to any history class, right? What is history? What is fact? Is it, if two people can watch something happen, a car wreck or whatever, three people can watch it happen, and you can ask them for an account of it, and they're going to give you three versions of it. So this is why we say, the winners write history. You have a jury trial, and it depends on who's on the jury. This is why jury selection. And you multiply that times every event, times the politicization of that. You add religion into the mix. You add money into the mix, right? And then people start thinking to themselves, well, you can't trust anything in history, right? Which is kind of what some people want you to do, right? You can't trust anything that anyone says, so just trust me, right? This is what a lot of dictators want. This is what a lot of strongmen want. 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, right? You can't trust any history. On the other end, we do have records and accounts from people that we then can turn around using archaeology, a non-literary form of looking at history, and we can say, okay, this archaeology does seem to corroborate what this text is claiming. Other times we say it's very clear that what this text is claiming could not have happened based on the archaeology. If you're looking for a number, that would be pure speculation, because every text is different and every location is different.
Right, but if I said to you, just, with the heck of it, boil it down to a number that you think generically, what percentage of history is accurately represented? Just your own personal view.
I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it because, the history of what? The history of farming in Iowa, that is not as politically loaded as like the history of the Israelites. If you start talking about the Holy Land, you're going to get all kinds of opinion, right? Mm-hmm. You're going to get theologically motivated opinions. You're going to get ethnically motivated opinions. Look at what's going on over there right now. Whereas if what's the history of rainfall in Iowa? That's something different, right? So, the history is going to differ depend on the question that you're asking, the research question that you're asking, where you are, and who you're asking, basically.
That's a good clarification. So history, I guess, is, if I was to imagine this, then the visual would be like a patchwork, let's say white is highly verified, black is dispute. Mm-hmm. So it'd be like a mosaic, or a polka dot, mm-hmm. a picture like that.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah.
And this is why I tell my students, you have to learn to live in the gray. You have to learn to be comfortable in that gray area. I usually hold up two fists and I say, on this left fist over here is our ideological norm. This is our ideological world. This is how we think the world ought to be, politically, religiously, economically. This is our ideological norm. And then on the other fist, I say, and these are the things that restrain us from achieving that. It's usually money, right? I want to live in this kind of house, but I don't have the money to afford it. A parent's keeping us from doing the things we want, or, a family, or whatever it is. You have your ideology and have the practicality. And most of us live in between those two things, and that's where most of our battles are fought and we wrestle. And the same is true with history. There's something happened. Something actually happened. I think there is, at some point, an objective history. I believe in objective history. The problem is that you've got all kinds of people trying to tell their version of it. That's that other hand. And somewhere in there is where we need to learn to be comfortable. a lot of people are not comfortable with that ambiguity. They're certainly not comfortable with it with religion, right? They just tell me what to believe and I'll believe it. And that way I know I'm going to heaven. And what I try to teach students over time is if you can learn that it's not that easy, that it's not that comfortable, that you need to learn to be comfortable wrestling with individual issues, ethical issues, social issues, wrestle with the text, learn to wrestle with God if you're a person of faith. That's what Job did, right?
Don't let him touch your hip. Yeah.
That's what Israel means, right? That's how he got his name. He wrestled with God. And if you can learn to be comfortable, if God is who he says he is, he can answer he can handle a few hard questions. If God is big and as strong and as powerful as he is, he can answer some hard questions from you. He can handle that. And so I encourage my students to, act like Job did and to say, I got some questions for you, God. Why are you doing this to me? And if you can be that bold, if you're a person of faith, if you can be that bold, then that's where you want to grow. That's the point to where you want to grow. That I don't see that as sinful. I don't see that as something that should be gotten away from. I think that's a good thing to be able. That's what you would do with your best friend. You should be able to tell the truth to your best friend. You should be able to talk to your best friend about the deepest, hardest things. And
yeah, true. Very interesting. I really like how you say that you teach the class. I think it's a really great way to do it. And I think it's very rare that people do what you do. They don't try to, push their thoughts on the class and shape them in the way they want, which I think is it's a credit to you, just so you know.
Thank you. I appreciate it. The students seem to respond very well to it. I get a lot of students when they take me for one class, they'll come back and take another one. They'll come back and take a third one after that. But I get a lot of students that are from a particular faith tradition, but I also get a lot of atheist and agnostic students. I get a complete mix of students, and I think they appreciate the authenticity. I think they appreciate someone who's willing to stand up there. I talk about my own life, my own experiences, my own background. I try not to tell too many dad jokes, right? I try not I try not to be too cornball, but I think they appreciate someone who will stand up there and say, look, if you don't get this from anyone else, here's how the world works, and here's what the Bible's actually saying, and this is a hard one to hear, and you got to deal with it. Don't just accept, this because your parent said it, or because your priest or your rabbi said it, or because I said it, because if you just accept someone else's faith, it's going to let you down. You have to wrestle with this and make it your own. And once you make it your own, then it's going to do more for you.
I don't have the vocabulary for this, but have you studied on how historians write about history and the process of selecting this material versus not, and how they shape the story? Like what is that called, and what are your insights into that process?
Yeah, this is historiography. So the process of writing history. And yeah, I mean, they do this a lot is in journalism, right? In journalism, they'll tell you it's not necessarily, it is both what you say, but it's also the things that you choose to write about and the things that you don't write about. So it's the things that you elevate and that you give visibility to because you're choosing to fill up your inches or your web page, right, with some visibility out about a particular topic. And it's the things that you choose to ignore. And then when you do choose to cover a particular topic, what approach am I going to take? Am I going to take a neutral approach? Am I going to give both sides of a particular issue? Am I going to try to lean one way, right? This is what politicians are always complaining about in debates, right? The moderators were biased. The moderators leaned this way or leaned this way, without thinking about the fact that, maybe it's because the moderators were asking a question that one of the candidates is weak on and the other one's strong on. And then they flipped it the other way. So historiography is the process of how what you choose to write, and then how you choose to present something. And, as you do this more and more, you see and you can pick up how a historian chooses to present. And a lot of it is rhetoric. So this is why I always tell students, take a foreign language, please take Greek, take Latin, take Hebrew, if you want to study the Bible, and learn these languages, because then when you see journalists write, the particular expressions, the way in which they turn a phrase, the timing of where they put this, how they tell the story, not just that they're telling it, but how they tell it is often very telling. It's going to tell you kind of how they feel the story, that what they want you to get out of it, how they want you to feel when they're done telling this particular historical account.
So do you feel like, I don't know, you've gotten better at assessing issues because you're constantly you're constantly striving to take this balanced approach?
I think, yeah, I've improved over the years at not only writing and not only trying to present a balanced account, but also in the points that I don't want to do that, when I am trying to get the reader to, basically go on a journey with me. I want you to come along, and I do this in the class with the students. I want you to learn this because then I want you to see this, and then I want you to see this thing over here. So, when I wrote cities, I want them to come on a journey with me. It's like, it's part of it's like a travel log, right? Come with me. I want to show you this. Now I want to show you this thing. And if I can get a student or a reader or a listener to discover with me, instead of me preaching at them or lecturing at them, right? Which is fun. I love lectures, right? I love listening to podcasts and listening to lectures. But if I can get them to discover with me, and now they want to walk down this path, they want to listen, they want to actually go out ahead of me, and they want to go see what's out there before I even get there. They're reading in advance. If I can get them to have that sense of discovery, they want to go dig on their own, then I've won. Right? Because now they want to go, they've got the itch, right? They want to go out and dig on their own. They want to uncover on their own. And who knows, maybe they'll become a scholar as well.
Yeah, that's really cool. Can you see, so because you've studied for so long, can you see the underlying persuasion architecture of a written piece, whether it's there or not, and, the commonalities and how people do it to shape what they write about?
Yes. Yeah, no, you can see that. And you can also appreciate when someone actually truly writes a neutral piece. And again, you'll see these charts sometimes, these news organizations are on the left and these news organizations. That's because people can see this. You can actually see this guy is trying to shade towards the left. He's actually crafting his piece, or she is crafting her piece, because she wants you to conclude that the person on the left is correct and the person on the right is wrong. And this person over here is writing this piece because he wants you to see that the person on the right is correct and the person on the left is wrong. But you can also see pieces where they're genuinely giving you the good arguments on both sides, and then the reader has to decide for themselves, this is actually a tough issue. I don't know. I gotta, and that's the ones that I like to read, because iron sharpens iron, and I love surrounding myself with smart people who disagree with me. I love to be challenged on the positions that I already hold. That's how peer review works, by the way. That's how scholars get better. We put forth an idea, it's how the scientific method works, right? You put forth a hypothesis, and then you test it, and you try to get other people to do that same experiment so that they can knock that down. The first thing I do when I walk in my office is I get my graduate student and I say, why am I wrong? Here's what I thought about in the shower this morning. Why am I wrong? Because before I go tell anybody else this thing, I don't want to embarrass myself. Why am I wrong? And if he can't come up with something, all right, I'll send it to somebody else. And that's what you're looking for. You're looking for a way of writing that is close as possible to being maybe not objective, but neutral. It's giving both sides fairly. And what we learn when we read the Bible is that the Bible is written from a Judahite point of view. It's written, for the most part, sometimes there's stuff that's northern, but for the most part, it's written from a point of view that promotes the Hebrew God. It promotes Jerusalem, doesn't like Samaritans, right? And then the New Testament promotes Christianity. It's trying to prove that Jesus is the Son of God. It is not objective history. It is just not objective history. It's trying to convince the reader that Jesus is the Son of God.
Have you gone over other religious texts like the Quran or
Sure.
The Bhagavad Gita, etc.?
Sure. The Book of Mormon. Yeah, and I try. No, I clearly, I have not read them to the extent that I've read the Hebrew Bible and the Greek New Testament. I teach Aramaic, so, the Aramaic portion of the Bible. The Targums, I teach Targumic Aramaic, so reading through Onkelos and Neophiti and Pseudo-Jonathan and these texts. I haven't read these other texts, but I try to expose my students to them. I try to show them, everybody's got their own holy text. And, what's interesting is Muslims will hold the Quran and read the Quran in the same way. There are some Muslims that read the Quran in a fundamentalist fashion. You have to take it literally, whatever it says you have to do. And there are other Muslims that say, okay, yeah, I see what it says, but we don't do that anymore, right? We're going to glean from that some ethics, and we're going to glean from that some of our history and identity. But yeah, we don't do that anymore, just like Christians today do with reading the New Testament about slavery. Yeah, I see what it says, slaves obey your masters, but we don't do that anymore. And so in every religion, there is a spectrum of people who read the Bible differently. And you can't say that these are Muslims and these aren't, or these are Christians and these aren't, because what people tend to do is they kind of shake their heads at the people to the right of themselves. Oh, those poor guys, and then they condemn the people to the left of themselves, right? So there are Christians out there will say, people more conservative than they are, they'll say, oh, those poor guys, they're just too strict. But to the people that are more liberal than they are, they'll say, oh, those aren't Christians at all, right? Those guys, they're too liberal. So those can't possibly be Christian. And what we need to realize is there's a broad spectrum of people, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, name your religion, right? That are going to read these holy texts differently, and that every individual person is just someplace on that spectrum, and that you look to the left and to the right, and there's going to be somebody who is also claiming to be a person of faith, right? A sincere person of faith with sincerely held beliefs who might not agree with you on a particular issue within that faith, but is still a devout person of faith. And if we can learn to live in a pluralistic society like that, where we can both claim to be Christians and yet disagree politically, religiously on issues, I think the world will be a much better place.
Excellent. Well, very good, Bob. What's the best way for people to find out more about your classes and your writings? Where can they go?
You can go to Bible and Archaeology. This is at the University of Iowa. You can go to bobcargill.com, or you can always go to a YouTube at Excavator, which is where we have all of the Bible and archaeology videos.
Excellent. Well, it's been a great call. I really appreciate you being here, and thank you for coming.
Rich, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.